They buried my wife on a gray morning that smelled like damp earth and old flowers. I stood at the back of the chapel, not because I wanted distance, but because I didn't trust my knees. When you've been married for 50 years, your body learns certain habits. Mine learned how to stand beside her. That morning, it kept leaning left, like she might still be there if I shifted my weight just right. If you're listening to this, give me 30 seconds. Just 30. Because what happened after that funeral wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't make the news. But it took something from me that no one can ever give back. My name is Harold. I'm 73 years old. And the last thing my wife ever did for me was leave me believing I still had a family. The service was simple. Hymns she liked. Words people say when they don't know what else to offer. She's at peace now. She's no longer in pain. I nodded, thanked them, shook hands with people I'd known for decades, men I'd worked alongside, women who used to borrow sugar from our kitchen. They looked at me with pity, the careful kind, like I might shatter if they squeezed too hard. My son Evan stood closer to the front, tall, well-dressed, distracted. He checked his phone more than once. I told myself not to read into it. People grieve differently, right? That's what everyone says. That's what I kept telling myself. I watched the casket lower into the ground. The sound of ropes sliding, the dull thud of finality. 50 years of shared mornings, arguments, laughter, and quiet nights reduced to a rectangle of polished wood disappearing into soil. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The tears felt stuck somewhere behind my ribs, pressing but not breaking through. When the service ended, people drifted away in pairs and small groups, murmuring plans for lunch, for traffic, for life continuing. I stayed where I was, hands folded, staring at the patch of earth that now held my wife. I thought about all the things I hadn't said, all the things I assumed I'd have time to say later. "Dad!" Evan's voice cut through the noise behind me, calm, controlled. I turned, relieved for a moment, a stupid, hopeful moment. No matter how old you get, some part of you still expects your child to be your anchor. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Of course," I said. My voice sounded older than I felt inside. We stepped a few feet away, far enough that no one could hear us, close enough that I could still smell the flowers. Evan didn't look at the grave. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Plain, white, my name written neatly on the front. "I need you to read this," he said. "Now?" I asked, confused. I thought it might be paperwork, something about the house, the arrangements, responsibilities passing from one generation to the next. "Yes," he said. "Now." I took the envelope. It felt lighter than it should have. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't put a hand on my shoulder. He just stood there, watching my face, like a man waiting for test results. I hadn't opened it yet. I hadn't read a word. But something in his eyes told me this wasn't about my wife. It was about me. I didn't know it then, but that envelope was the beginning of what people would later call a revenge story. To me, it was simply the moment I realized grief wasn't the worst thing waiting for me that day. Evan didn't stay by my side after the service. He moved through the crowd with quick, efficient steps, stopping only long enough to shake a hand or accept a brief condolence. Every time someone mentioned my mother, "Your mom was such a kind woman," he nodded, thanked them, and drifted away again, like he was late for something more important than grief. I told myself not to judge. People mourn in their own ways. That's what the pastor had said. That's what neighbors whispered. I repeated it in my head the way you repeat a prayer you don't fully believe, but hope will still work. I watched him from a distance. My son had grown into a man I didn't always recognize. He stood straighter than I remembered, shoulders squared, wearing a suit that fit too well for a funeral. Not flashy, just expensive enough to say he didn't worry about the price tag. His phone buzzed once. He checked it, frowned slightly, then slipped it back into his pocket. There was a time when he would have stood right next to me, when he would have leaned in and asked, "You okay, Dad?" Back when his voice still cracked and he needed my approval for things that didn't matter. That boy felt very far away now. People came up to me instead, old friends, distant relatives, a few coworkers from my past who had heard the news and showed up out of respect. They spoke softly, like my ears were fragile. "She was a good woman, Harold," one of them said. "You were lucky to have each other," said another. I smiled. I thanked them. I meant it. But every time someone said you were lucky, something twisted inside my chest. Luck had nothing to do with 50 years of showing up, of working late, of fixing what broke, of staying when leaving would have been easier. Evan didn't hear those words. Or maybe he did and chose not to. At one point, I caught his eye across the lawn. For a split second, I thought he might come over. He looked at me, nodded once, then turned away to answer another question from someone asking about his work, his company, his future. That's when it hit me. Not all at once, but slow and heavy. I was standing alone at my wife's funeral. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who know your name, you understand that feeling. It's a strange kind of loneliness, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in quietly, like dust. After most people left, I walked back toward the car. Evan was already there, speaking to someone near the trunk. He finished the conversation, then glanced at his watch. "Dad," he said, finally turning to me again, "we should talk." His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't warm either. It sounded scheduled. I nodded. "Sure." Before we stepped aside, I paused for a moment and looked around the parking lot. Rows of cars. Familiar faces driving away. Life moving forward like it always does. If you're listening to this from somewhere far away, another city, another state, you might be picturing a place like this right now. A quiet lot after a funeral. The kind of place where big things happen without witnesses. Evan reached into his jacket. That was when I realized something was coming. I didn't know what. I just knew it wasn't comfort. And I still didn't know that this wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of losing my place as a father. We walked a short distance away from the others, toward a patch of grass that had been trampled flat by shoes and grief. The air felt heavier there, like the day was holding its breath. Evan stopped first. I stopped because he did. That had always been the pattern between us, him setting the pace, me matching it without thinking. He didn't look at me right away. He stared past my shoulder, toward the parking lot, where cars were pulling out one by one. Engines starting, doors closing, life reassembling itself. When he finally turned, his face was calm. Too calm for a day like this. "I won't keep you long," he said. "That's all right," I replied. I thought he might say something about his mother, about how she would have wanted us to look after each other. That's the kind of thing sons usually say when a family loses its center. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The motion was deliberate, careful, like he didn't want to wrinkle whatever was inside. He pulled out a plain white envelope and held it between his fingers for a moment, as if weighing it. "This is for you," he said. I glanced down at it. My name was written neatly on the front. No return address, no explanation. Just Harold in his handwriting. I felt a flicker of confusion, followed by a strange, unwanted sense of formality.
"What's this?" I asked.
"You should read it," he said. "Now. Not later. Not when you get home. Now." I hesitated, not because I was afraid of the envelope, but because of the setting. We were still at the cemetery. The smell of fresh dirt clung to everything. My wife was 10 yards away, buried less than an hour ago. There are places where certain conversations don't belong, and this felt like one of them. "Can it wait?" I asked gently. Evan shook his head. "No." Something in his voice closed the door on further questions. I took the envelope from him. It was lighter than I expected, almost empty. Just paper. No documents thick enough to matter. No weight that could justify the look in his eyes. For a second, I didn't open it. I looked at him instead, searching for something familiar. A crack. A hint of regret. I found nothing. He stood there with his hands at his sides, posture straight, expression fixed. Not angry, not sad. Resolved. "All right," I said. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet. I unfolded it slowly, aware of how loud the paper sounded in the quiet air. My eyes dropped to the first line, then the second. I read it once, then again. The words didn't change. "Dad, I'm not your son." No greeting, no explanation, no apology. Just that. The world didn't tilt or spin. There was no dramatic rush of sound. Everything went very still. I became aware of small details instead. The way the wind brushed past my ears, the faint click of a car door closing somewhere behind us, the steady weight of my own breathing. I looked up at Evan. He was watching me closely now, like he was bracing for impact. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. In that moment, the envelope felt heavier than any box I'd ever carried. He had handed it to me as if it were just another task to complete, another responsibility to pass along. And standing there, holding those words in my hands, I understood something I hadn't known before. This wasn't a conversation. It was a declaration. And whatever came next, my life had already split cleanly into before and after the moment my son chose to put that sentence on paper and place it in my hands. I don't remember how long I stood there after reading the letter. Seconds, maybe, or minutes. Time does strange things when something inside you snaps but doesn't make a sound. Evan kept watching me. I could feel it without looking up. He was waiting for something. Anger, denial, an argument, maybe even tears. I didn't give him any of that. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt heavy, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I folded the paper once, then again, slowly. The way you fold something fragile, not because it deserves care, but because you don't want it to tear any more than it already has. I slid it back into the envelope and held it in my hand. "You done?" Evan asked. His voice wasn't cruel. That was the strange part. It was neutral, businesslike. The same tone he used when he talked about contracts or timelines, as if what he'd just handed me was a fact to be processed, not a blade meant to cut. "Yes," I said. The word came out hoarse, but steady enough. He nodded, like we'd just completed a task. Good. We walked back toward the car without another word. Gravel crunched under our shoes. Somewhere behind us, someone laughed softly, maybe remembering something kind about my wife. I wondered if they knew how quiet a life could end, even with people standing all around it. At the car, Evan opened the trunk and placed his jacket inside. He closed it carefully, pressing down until it latched. Then he turned to me. "I've already spoken to the attorney," he said. "Everything's taken care of." I didn't ask what everything meant. I was afraid if I did, my voice might betray me. Instead, I nodded. "There are some things you'll need to pick up from the house," he continued. "But it can't be today. I need space." Space. The word hung there between us. "Of course," I said. He seemed relieved. Not grateful, relieved. Like a problem had just solved itself. He checked his watch again, then reached for the driver's door. "I'll call you," he said. "We'll figure out logistics." Logistics. That was what 40 years of raising him had come down to. I watched him get into the car. Watched him start the engine. He didn't look back when he pulled away. The tires rolled over the gravel, then onto the road, carrying him forward without hesitation. I stood there alone. For a moment, I considered calling out, saying his name, asking him to wait. But I already knew what would happen if I did. He would turn, listen politely, and tell me this wasn't the time. That we could talk later. That everything had already been decided. So I stayed quiet. Silence has a sound when you're old enough to hear it. It's the sound of things you don't chase anymore. Not because they don't matter, but because you finally understand what chasing costs. I walked to my own car and sat inside without starting it. The seat felt colder than I remembered. I rested the envelope on the passenger seat and stared at it. A single sentence. That was all it took to erase a lifetime of school lunches, scraped knees, late-night talks, and early mornings. If you've ever swallowed words you deserved to say because you knew they wouldn't change anything, you know that feeling. It isn't weakness, it's restraint. The kind that comes from knowing some moments aren't meant to be fought. They're meant to be endured. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. As I drove away from the cemetery, I realized something that scared me more than the letter itself. I wasn't angry. Not yet. And whatever comes after silence like that is never small. I didn't open the envelope again until that night. The house was quiet in the way only an old house can be. Settled, patient, familiar with waiting. I sat at the kitchen table where my wife used to sort mail and coupons, the overhead light casting a small circle that felt too bright for one person. The envelope lay in front of me, exactly where I'd placed it, like it hadn't moved because it didn't need to. It had already done its work. I told myself I already knew what was inside. I'd read the sentence, I'd folded the paper, I'd survived the drive home. There was no reason to look again. But something kept pulling at me. Not curiosity, responsibility. The same instinct that made me double-check doors before bed, even when I knew they were locked. I opened it. The letter was still there, the same single line in the same clean handwriting. I didn't read it again. My eyes slid past it to what was tucked behind. A second sheet. At first glance, it looked like a copy of something official. Creased, slightly yellowed at the edges. I drew it out and flattened it on the table. The words came into focus slowly, as if my eyes were tired of bad news and needed time to adjust. A birth certificate. Not the original, a copy. Old enough that the ink had softened, the paper thinned by years of being folded and unfolded. I recognized the names immediately. My wife's name, the date, the hospital. Evan's name printed clearly across the top. My hands trembled as I traced the lines down the page. And then I saw it. Under father, there was no name. Just a thick black line drawn straight through the space where my name should have been. Not crossed out neatly, not initialed, just erased by force, like someone wanted to make sure nothing could ever be written there again. I stared at that line for a long time, long enough for the room to feel smaller, long enough for the hum of the refrigerator to grow loud in my ears, long enough to understand what this really was. It wasn't proof, it was a decision. Somewhere along the way, maybe years ago, maybe quietly, maybe when it suited him, my son had chosen not just to question who I was to him, but to remove me entirely. Not with an argument, not with anger, with a pen. 40 years collapsed into that empty space. I thought about the nights I stayed up when he was sick, the mornings I drove him to school in the dark, the jobs I passed up because they would have meant less time at home. I thought about the way he used to call out for me when he had a bad dream, and how he'd fall asleep again the second I sat on the edge of his bed. None of that was on the paper. I realized then that the letter wasn't the cruelest part. The sentence hurt, yes, but sentences can be said in anger. Written words can be taken back. This couldn't. This was my name being denied retroactively, my effort reduced to a technicality, my presence rewritten as optional. I folded the birth certificate carefully and slid it back into the envelope beneath the letter. I didn't cry. I didn't tear it up. I didn't even curse. I just sat there, breathing, letting the weight of it settle where it belonged. If you've ever done everything right and still been told it didn't count, you know this kind of pain. It doesn't explode. It sinks. Quietly. Deep enough that no one sees it unless you let them. I turned off the light and went to bed. And in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't about blood. It was about erasing debt. And my son hadn't just denied who I was. He had denied what he owed. The morning after I found the birth certificate, I woke before the sun. That wasn't unusual. At my age, sleep comes in lighter layers. But that morning felt different. There was no rush of panic, no knot in my chest, just a steady awareness, like something had finally settled into place. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sky lighten one shade at a time. The envelope rested on the table behind me. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. Once you see something clearly, you don't have to keep staring at it to remember what it means. Evan didn't call. I hadn't expected him to. People who make decisions like that rarely check back to see how they land. They assume the impact is over once the words are delivered. I spent the morning doing ordinary things. I folded laundry. I took out the trash. I fixed a loose hinge on the cabinet door. Simple tasks, grounding ones. The kind of work that reminds you your hands still know how to be useful, even when your place in someone's life has been questioned. Around noon, I drove to the storage unit on the edge of town. It was a small place I'd rented years ago, back when Evan was in college and space at the house was tight. I hadn't been there in a long time. The manager recognized me anyway. He nodded, handed me the key, didn't ask questions. Inside the unit were boxes I hadn't opened in decades. Old tax records, tools I never threw away. And one small metal file cabinet, dented at the corners, heavy for its size. I unlocked it and pulled out the folders one by one. Documents don't carry emotion. They don't raise their voices or lower their eyes. They just sit there, patient, waiting for someone to read them carefully. I flipped through contracts, receipts, letters with letterheads that no longer existed. And then I found what I was looking for. Proof doesn't announce itself. It doesn't glow, it just fits. Quietly, exactly where it belongs. I closed the cabinet and sat back on the concrete floor, letting the coolness seep through my clothes. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to exhale fully. Evan thought this was about identity, about blood, about a sentence on a piece of paper. He was wrong. This was about contribution, about what had been built, supported, and paid for over time, about effort that doesn't disappear just because someone decides it's inconvenient. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vengeful. What I felt was something steadier than anger. Clarity. When you've been erased quietly, you don't get loud to prove you exist. You get precise. I locked the unit, handed the key back to the manager, and drove home without turning on the radio. My mind was already arranging things into order, the way it always had when a problem needed solving. That evening, I placed the envelope back in the drawer where I keep important papers. Not as a reminder, but as a reference. Something to be addressed when the time was right. I wasn't going to confront Evan. Not yet. Not with words. Some truths need to be revealed, not argued. And if you're listening to this, and you've ever felt your effort dismissed, your sacrifices minimized, or your role rewritten after the work was already done, pause for a moment. Ask yourself this: did you really lose your value? Or did someone just stop wanting to acknowledge it? If this story is touching something you've lived through, you're not alone. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. And what comes after preparation is never accidental. That night, I didn't dream. I lay awake, listening to the house breathe. The soft tick of cooling walls, the faint hum of electricity, the quiet proof that something still stood even after being emptied. I thought about calling Evan. The phone was right there, one reach away. I could have asked him why. I could have demanded answers, explanations, proof. I could have forced him to look me in the eye and say the words out loud instead of hiding them behind paper. But I didn't, because I already knew something he didn't. When someone denies what they owe, they rarely understand the cost until it arrives without warning. And cost doesn't always come as punishment. Sometimes it comes as absence. Sometimes as paperwork. Sometimes as a silence that no apology can reverse. I placed the envelope back in the drawer, closed it carefully, and turned off the light. This wasn't the end of my story with my son, but it was the end of my need to beg for a place I had already earned. Whatever came next would come on its own terms. And for the first time since the funeral, I slept. Not peacefully, but steadily.